The Inside Star Trek album. This is episode 65.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casco, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
The release of this album in 1976 was one of those events in the 1970s that just told you Star Trek was coming back. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casco. Yeah, Inside Star Trek was released in 1976, and fans were definitely willing to pay the $6.95 to hear Gene talk about their favorite show.
$6.95.
I know.
And we're going to talk about that album and hear some highlights. But first, we need to let listeners know how they can reach us.
Yeah, just visit our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/70strek. If you want to send us an email, you can do that too. You can send it to 70strek@gmail.com.
And you can also find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. Just search for 70s Trek, and it would be great if you could leave us a comment or a review because it helps other Trek fans find the show. The bulk of Inside Star Trek was recorded in July 1976 at the United Western Studios in Los Angeles, and it was released by Columbia Records on October 15th, 76.
Gene interviewed William Shatner, DeForest Kelley, Mark Leonard, and Ray Bradbury at that July recording session. Unfortunately, Bradbury's interview couldn't be included because of a contractual difficulty. He also, though, interviewed Isaac Asimov, but he did that earlier in the year in New York.
It's a shame that Ray Bradbury interview couldn't have been included. That would have been really interesting.
Oh, definitely. Isaac Asimov was fascinating, but Ray Bradbury would have been just as fascinating.
Only because he's not a guy that you hear a lot from.
Well, right.
Or hear from a lot.
What?
I'm going to use the English language.
Whichever.
That's right. You know, Leonard Nimoy was also asked to participate in the recording, but he declined. His relationship with Roddenberry had grown pretty sour by 1976.
Yeah, he was upset over being offered the role of Quester, only to have Gene give it to Robert Fox without being told.
Ugh.
On top of that, he was also upset about not being paid royalties for Star Trek, especially since the show is making a lot of money in syndication for Paramount.
Yeah, right. And as if that wasn't enough, you know, he was upset with Roddenberry too because Roddenberry had been touring college campuses for years and had been showing the Star Trek bloopers reel. Now, while the crowds loved it and thought it was fun, Nimoy was a little PO'd. You know, he felt that those bloopers had originally been put together to be shown just to the cast and crew of Star Trek, and it was for Christmas parties. And Here they are making the rounds out in public, and he had the position that, look, this was never meant to see in public. I'm trying to have a serious career here. You're killing me. He felt that Roddenberry was exploiting him without his consent. So why don't we get into this album? I'll start by telling you how the album starts. And there's only one way it could begin. That's with the theme from Star Trek.
Yeah.
Of course, it's a little different version, which is kind of neat. And then Roddenberry provides his thoughts on the album, sort of an introduction. And then we dive into track 3, which is a conversation between Gene Roddenberry and William Shatner. Now, Roddenberry asks Shatner, how much of Captain Kirk is you, William Shatner? Here's what Shatner says. He says, well, Gene, the act of putting on a television show is such a back-breaking, all-encompassing task. The hours we put in are so enormous. To be able to make up a character and sustain that for the years that we did it would be impossible, and I think for anyone, but especially impossible for me. So what essentially comes out is William Shatner as himself saying the lines that were written for me to say in a situation I was placed in. He said this, and I thought this was very, very noteworthy. I think, Shatner goes on to say, that the people you see on television playing leads in television series, that's what they're like, unquote. So essentially he's telling us here in 1976, yeah, you're really just seeing Bill Shatner on screen. I wasn't doing a lot of acting. Wow. Okay. I was giving him all kinds of credit, too.
I know. Well, we'll change that going forward.
That's right. And then Roddenberry asked, did Captain Kirk influence Bill Shatner at all? He replied, quote, I don't think that I carried home any of the characteristics of Captain Kirk, other than, as I just said, those characteristics were me. But the wisdom and the sagacity and the courage that Captain Kirk evidenced in the play of the week was written as fiction. And I often wish that I could be able to do that in my own personal life. But fallible me is fallible me. Right. I think that's really noteworthy, too, because he's basically saying, you know what? Nobody's Captain Kirk. Nobody's that courageous. Nobody has the answers at his fingertips that quickly. And I was just doing what the writers told me to do.
Right.
Gene also asked Shatner about rumors and troubles between himself and Nimoy on the set. And I wanted to play this clip.
And fans talk about rumors of trouble on stage. And very often the subject of you and Leonard Nimoy come up, that they wouldn't speak to each other, that there were great problems on stage. How would you address yourself to that?
Well,
we can cut this out of the recording if you'd like.
No. I really love Leonard. I really care for him a great deal. He's a very fine human being. He stands behind what he says with his total character, and when he says something, he really means it. I mean, you can take him at his word. He is slyly humorous and very affectionate in his own way that is remarkable. And to address myself to the elements of friction on the stage, I would put it in the way that two children in the same family might squabble over something. Loving each other, but squabbling. I mean, any member of a family would know what I mean, and that means all of us. If you can say, no, I don't think that's right, in that querulous tone, and be angry at the moment, and then forget it the following moment because you care for that person.
I find that interesting only because he's basically saying, yeah, we quarreled, but he's not really saying, yeah, it was my fault, or I should have said this, or, you know what I'm saying? It's just, we were brothers and we quarreled. Leave it alone.
Right. It happens.
It happens. There's a point in this interview, too, that Shatner kind of turned the tables on Gene and started asking him questions. And specifically, he said, hey, what happened? Why did the show not come back? And Roddenberry talked a little bit about his showdown with NBC over the Friday night time slot for season 3, and we've talked about that. But then Gene said this.
I think there was a little rationalization in that on my part, and I've never said this before from a platform or any other way. I think also what was affecting me at that time was enormous fatigue. I think maybe I was looking for an excuse to get out from under the fight that I had not just been having for 2 years, but really for 4.
Right.
As you recall, we'd made first pilot, turned down a second pilot, and then 2 years of production. So I think there was some rationalization there. I think the fatigue had just caught up.
Wow. If you're listening to this album closely, that's a little piece of news there that nobody had ever heard before. We'd heard up to that point that, it was NBC and they hated the show and ratings from their part. And really, Gene was a little tired and didn't want to fight for it.
Yeah, well, he's beat up.
I can understand that. I completely understand that. Shatner also asked him if he had to do it over again, what would Gene do differently? And here was his answer, quote, I think I would come back and produce it the third year myself if I had to do it over, unquote. So I think he had a little bit of regret.
Yeah.
But that happens with hindsight,
Right.
My favorite clip from that interview, though, is this one.
I think one fan comment we got during the third year quite often was, how come Captain Kirk gets a new girl every week?
Well, he uses up the old one.
That's kind of funny.
Yeah, it is.
All right. And then the album shifts gears. And we actually begin to hear pieces of Gene Roddenberry's college visits.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the creator of Star Trek, the great bird of the galaxy, Gene Roddenberry.
Dude, can you imagine if you were that guy at that particular college who was just in the, student activities council and you got to introduce Gene Roddenberry?
Yeah, you'd have to wear Depends because you'd wet yourself.
I'd wet myself
So
every
excited.
time I'd listen to this album. I'd be walking around with this for the rest of my life. Hey, dude, this is me.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the creator of...
Dude, come here. I got to play you something.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the creator of...
Hi, honey. I'd like to marry you, but first I need to play something for you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the creator...
Okay. I'll move on.
There's my ringtone.
That's right. That's right. But really, it's these sections that come up then in the album that are the real value, I think, of this album. It really serves to document, even if it's just a small way and it's in pieces, it really documents those college lectures that he gave throughout the 70s. And there's not a lot that we can really refer to. Unfortunately, not many of these things were taped or filmed at the time. They kind of happened. And we don't know a lot of the content unless you actually sat in on one of them.
Right.
So it's kind of neat to have these recordings. He opens with a story about the difficulties he had with NBC over the characters of Number One and Mr. Spock. Gene says it got so bad that he knew he could only have one of them going forward. He could only save one. So he says that he merged Number One's personality, the logic, the stoicism, with Spock's personality and kept Spock, and then he ended up marrying the woman.
So, Number One from the cage, right?
Right. That was a joke. You could have laughed a little bit with me. There, thank you. All right, track 8 is an imaginary conversation between Gene and Sarek, and they're talking about Spock's background. I would have much rather heard, to be honest with you, from Mark Leonard.
Yeah.
And what did he think of Star Trek? But we kind of have, Mark Leonard in character as Sarek instead. And on the next track, Gene talks about his TV project, The Quester Tapes. What about you? You looked at some of the later tracks, right?
Right. So I picked up at track 8 with McCoy's RX for life, or, prescription for life. And this is, conversation back and forth between DeForest Kelley and Gene Roddenberry. And much like the question Gene asked Shatner, he's talking to McCoy about his character or himself and relating it to Dr. McCoy. And, DeForest says that, as an actor, you've got to pick up some of the traits and characteristics of the role you're playing, to actually play them on the screen. And Gene, is kind of jokingly says, well, what if you're playing Jack the Ripper? And he goes, well, hopefully you don't retain any of those characteristics. But he says that the McCoy character has many human qualities that are definitely worth emulating.
No, that's nice.
Yeah, I thought it was great. Then, DeForest talks about letters that he's getting, and in particular from people that have been disabled or sick in some way, and that he's actually gone and visited in hospitals or whatever, people that are sick or whatever.
Isn't that, not to cut you off, but isn't that amazing? I mean, each of these people, these actors, will tell you that at different times they have gotten either letters or comments from fans that say, you changed my life.
Right.
Or you allowed this to happen. Or I'm an engineer because of you, Scotty, or a doctor because of you. It's amazing the stories of inspiration that springs from this show.
It is. And Gene talks to DeForest about that. He goes, well, how do you think you help them? By, writing them back or visiting them. And DeForest responds that, I think I'm giving them hope. And if at all, it's a hope of, a better future or, being able to dream about a better future. So I thought that was really nice.
That's neat.
And the next thing they talk about is medicine. And DeForest and Gene talk back and forth about medicine and what DeForest thinks about it today. And here's what he says, and I quote, when millions of inhabitants on a planet can't afford medical care, then it's obviously too damn expensive. Now, who does that sound like?
Right.
It sounds like McCoy. And then, Gene goes, well, you seem to be kind of critical of medicine today. And Dee just says, medicine reflects the society it is a part of. Dee goes on to explain, I think medicine, we're looking at too many outside solutions when you should be focused inside. Doctors should teach people how they can heal themselves, without all of the, here's a prescription, a quick fix for this or that.
Wow, that is profound. We're actually starting to see that happen today.
Right.
As more and more cancer patients either can't afford or don't want to take the drugs that, not only kill the cancer, but almost kill the patient.
Exactly.
And so they're trying to fix it with their mind and in a holistic way. He is 40 years ahead of his time.
He sure is. But he saw it even back in, 1976.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of cool.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So that was a good interview. Now go to track 9, which is Star Trek philosophy. And this is where Gene is talking about, why Star Trek was such a phenomenon.
We had an idea, and we had a premise. Thank you, and we still believe that. As a matter of fact, we decided to risk the whole show on that premise. We believe that the often ridiculed mass audience is sick of this world's petty nationalism and all its old ways and old hatreds, and that people are not only willing but anxious to think beyond those petty beliefs that have for so long kept mankind divided. Thank you.
They took a risk, and they're trying not to have the general population or the viewers be talked down to like they've been talked down to in the past. He wants them to think and, not just, absorb whatever's thrown at them.
And clearly he proved that there is an audience out there that does think, that can imagine, that can intellectualize, and they're not necessarily society's elites. They're everyday folks that go to work and earn a paycheck. But you know what? They think too.
Exactly. So, that was a very good message from Gene. Now I go to track 10. This is entitled Asimov's World of Science Fiction. So obviously this is where he's interviewing Isaac Asimov. They start off with Gene recalling how he met Isaac for the first time. And back in 1965, Gene's at a convention in Cleveland, and he's showing the Star Trek pilot. And as the pilot begins, there's a group of people off the side, and they're just jibber-jabbering. They won't shut up. And so he walks over and goes, hey, the pilot's starting. Can you guys, be quiet? Well, after it was over, somebody came up to him and said, do you know who you told to be quiet? You just told Isaac Asimov to be quiet. And Isaac chirps up here in the interview, and he goes, well, that's fair. I'm always talking. But they both talk about how they've been friends ever since, and that Isaac Asimov actually really liked the pilot.
Neat.
Yeah. the next part with Asimov, they talk about science fiction and fantasy and the difference between the two. And, you know, Isaac Asimov's talking about what's that science fiction is actually something that you can go from here, and if you can envision it and you have the appropriate changes from here to the future, you can actually make that happen. Fantasy, you can't. It's a fantastic world. It's made up, you know, elves and whatever and magic, and it really, you can't do that. So, in other words, science fiction is really attainable.
Right. It's based in science.
And if the science fiction author, and he talks about this quite a bit too, is, you know, a real science fiction author and isn't just making science up, he's actually basing it in science, then it actually should be attainable at some point in the future.
Agreed.
And this was interesting, and I didn't know this about Gene. Gene piped up and said, "Hey, I used your Asimov's Guide to Science during the whole making of Star Trek."
Oh, neat.
Yeah. So he kept that as a reference. And of course, Asimov is saying, well, you know, it's only as good as me keeping it up to date. And then he talks about, again, back to science fiction authors and the biggest mistake they make, not basing it in science. He goes, that's what I liked about Star Trek. That, you know, you stuck to the laws of science, but if you had to break the laws, you did it intelligently and plausibly.
That's high praise coming from Isaac Asimov.
It sure is. So that, I mean, that pretty much wraps up Asimov's section. We'll go to track 11, and this is called The Enterprise Runs Aground. This is kind of funny. Gene starts this by saying, sexual equality is as basic as any other equality. And of course, the crowd's going crazy, clapping, blah, blah, blah. No, he goes, now, I'm going to keep using women as sex objects. But in fairness, I'm going to use men as sex objects too. So we're going to be fair here. And then he tells a story about trying to get Star Trek, you know, on the air. And he has this person from the network visit him. And he goes, look, I got a problem with there's 50% men in your, you know, Enterprise crew, and there's 50% women. And the guy says right out, and Gene quotes him as saying something like, you know, this just kind of looks like there's a lot of fooling around going on up there. So Gene and him go back and forth, have a little argument about it. The guy leaves, but then later comes back and says, okay, here's your final offer. 30% have to be women, or you're not going on the air. And Gene goes, oh, okay, concedes. I think 30% women could run the entire ship. So
that's funny.
Yeah. Track 12. This is a great track. Letter from a Network Censor. Now, Gene was asked to write a letter that would be a typical letter he would get from a network censor. Now, he did this, you know, as a fictional, presenting a script on the Bible. And this is really a comedy bit. And, you know, I wish we could play the whole 5 minutes here, but I'll just give you a couple highlights at the beginning. The letter consisted of, or started with, this script has a preoccupation with violence, sex, and nudity. The story protagonist, God, is completely unmotivated and particularly bloodthirsty. And you seem to have a prejudice towards a single tribe. It should have an equal treatment of all minority groups. And I summarized, but there's a list of minority groups that he rattled off.
Oh, gosh.
And then there, just one more. and that'll give you, but you've really got to listen to this. It's on YouTube. He says, Noah's family is going to repopulate the world. We cannot have any reference to incest on network TV. But it's all like this. It's hysterical. It was kind of lighthearted. So a good little track here.
That is a neat track.
Okay, and then the last track 13, entitled Star Trek Dream, Ballad 1 and Ballad 2. Here, Gene is asked to give a little story that nobody's heard about Star Trek. How, what hasn't been told, something maybe intimate or personal. And I didn't know this until I, listened to this track. Gene talks about, as a kid, how he was handicapped as a child. He had difficulty breathing, sensitivity to light, spindly legs, as he called them, and he was weak. And so because of that, he became a reader, an avid reader, and a dreamer. He recalls, maybe his first inkling of Star Trek happened when he was about 8, and he's sitting in a soap curtain pretending to be a captain on a ship. He goes on to say that many years later, he's now a little bit stronger. So he got exposed to science fiction, and he claims this brought him back to reality. He got out of that dreaming mode, so to speak, and, looked at a broader world. And what he learned was to view life as a traveler, to learn and enjoy everything and everyone around him. And he claims really this enlightenment that he had, if you will, was the start of him formulating the IDIC concept, the infinite diversity from infinite combinations. And he really claims that this is the start of Star Trek.
That's really interesting to hear because, an idea like that, the kernel of an idea, can start anywhere at any time.
Yeah.
And you just never know. Well, It's worth noting here that Inside Star Trek was re-released in 1999. It was included with an expanded edition of the soundtrack for Star Trek, the motion picture. It was a 2-disc set. That 1999 version had some additional tracks that weren't on the 76 version. It starts with Nichelle Nichols giving us an introduction prior to Gene's intro. And then Gene shares some thoughts on science fiction and even an explanation of his Genesis 2 pilot.
And he also talked about cyborg tools and ET life forms, where he's saying that, humans have advanced to a point that we're outpacing evolution. We're coming up with ways to solve evolutionary problems like, creating cyborg tools like glasses and spacesuits. And what this does is it allows you to get into some new environments that our physical bodies just can't sustain, hence space.
And we take these ideas so much for granted.
Oh, yeah.
But even slapping on a scuba tank and swimming under the water into the ocean.
Right.
We're not supposed to be there.
We're extending our body with artificial means, basically. Right. And he says that, if aliens are coming here to the planet, they've got to do the same thing. They've got a long journey, and they've got to be either, doing something similar, that we can't imagine, or even going as far as being a totally artificial life form. So it was really interesting track that was added here. And then the last track was basically an out that Nichelle Nichols did. And she did a really good job talking about Gene's vision of the future and how humans will one day rise to the moral heights to match their technical achievements.
Kelly, do you have any final thoughts about Inside Star Trek?
Well, my number one thought was that I went into this not hearing this this LP, this soundtrack before. So I went in fresh. I kind of was thinking it was going to be cheesy, and it actually was extremely good. I've listened to it about 3 times now, end to end, and just I recommend it highly to anybody that's interested in Star Trek and insights from Gene Roddenberry.
You know, for me, it gets a little schmaltzy or corny maybe once during the talk with Mark Leonard, who has to stay in character as Sarek. To me, we know it's Mark Leonard. And even the whole beaming him in thing, and it's a little talking down to the fans maybe, but it's okay. And
I thought it was kind of odd that they focused on how the Sarek character and Amanda.
Oh, I know. Right. Had a baby.
Conceived a baby. Yes.
Come on, Gene. Get your mind out of the gutter.
Exactly.
But it's also probably one of the first albums of its type ever produced. You know, to have an entire album dedicated to the concepts and philosophies behind a TV show that was canceled.
Yes.
I mean, that's remarkable. And it's a wonderful document on Roddenberry's, Shatner's, Kelley's, and Nichelle Nichols' thoughts about Star Trek at that moment in time in 1976 as things are beginning to percolate. And so, you know, for me, from that perspective, this thing's a gold mine. Next week, we're talking about stories that were never made.
It's the Rejected Pitches from 1976. See you then.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.